Welcome to the Real Bible Rob podcast. And today I'd like to do a little bit of a dive into some biblical studies about a king that you probably don't know. And if you do know this king, you may not know much about him or why he's so central. And I'm talking about King Josiah. And Josiah and Jeremiah, who's much more famous, of course, the prophet Jeremiah, and we have a whole book with Jeremiah, were contemporaries, approximately the same age. We don't know if one was older than the other or not, but both were very young when they met and they were starting to work together. And you could see that, Josiah and Jeremiah really kind of grew up together and spent at least 10, maybe 20 years together before Josiah died. So you can see the king and his prophet. And I like to say to people, I go, if you know the book of Jeremiah, its context, the fact that it's so closely linked to Josiah, then you kind of understand the story of a great part of the Old Testament, one of the very central themes of the Old Testament. So you can almost say if you know Jeremiah, then you know the Old Testament. I know that's a bit of a strong statement, but hear me out. I can kind of convince you of that. It's because Jeremiah is actually the most political book of the Old Testament because it Jeremiah was with kings and saw how kings in the court operated and how they became self-deluded a little bit. And and even King Josiah, who's considered, a great king because he reinstituted, rediscovered the laws of Moses and consolidated Judaism, the religion of Judah, into Jerusalem again after about a century of bad kings that didn't do those things. And they this has come is come to known as the Deuteronomists. When Josiah finds uh, the scrolls or finds the book, the hidden book or the old book of Moses that's been rediscovered, we are led to believe that that is the book of Deuteronomy, and that it fits very well with all of the other activities of the Deuteronomists around this era. When you look at biblical studies and the different sources of materials that go into the Old Testament books, a lot of the uh, material that you see in Genesis all the way through the Kings uh, come from the Deuteronomists, along with the Yahwehists and so forth. But it's mostly priestly class people that come in with the chronicler, and this would be some of the later books like Ezra, Nehemiah. Some of the later prophets, and of course the books of Chronicles. So you can kind of roughly divide the Old Testament into that. There are four sources they talk about, but the two big influences are basically the Deuteronomists for the early parts and the priestly class for the later parts. And so that's one reason why it's so important that King Josiah and his story is known well, because if you know the idea of finding the scroll, if you know the idea of consolidating the religion in Jerusalem again, this is a very central theme of the entire Old Testament, is the consolidation of the cult of Yahweh or Judaism, and we see how that progresses. One of the things that you learn, and if you talk to a lot of biblical scholars and really look at it, is that before this period, that there was probably less Israel. The Israelites were probably less monotheistic and more than we realize, and probably a lot more connected with the neighboring communities. So the other kingdoms and the gods, the Baals of the, or they're often called the gods of the neighboring communities in Canaan. And in fact, there are some biblical scholars who think that Yahweh was just one of the Baals, and and Yahweh was the Baal for the Israelites. Now, um, that can be kind of controversial, and that's sort of a bit esoteric. But the idea being is that really the consolidation and the focus on Yahweh really comes when you understand, and the single God, the monotheistic God, really comes in this period as they're consolidating into Jerusalem. So, what does this mean uh, for Jeremiah? Well, Jeremiah, like I said, was with Josiah. Josiah's father, who was King Amon, his grandfather was King Manasseh, were both considered uh, it, wicked kings, bad kings, kings who did not follow the Lord. And Manasseh was uh, in power for 55 years, and Amon was in power for 31 years. And it goes all the way back to Josiah's great grandfather, King Hezekiah, was the last king that was considered a good king because Hezekiah was the one that saved Judah from the Assyrians. So you look at this and you go, wow, there's this big revival after almost 100 years, almost a century of bad kings from their point of view. And this is great. Jeremiah and Josiah are, king and prophet. Jeremiah's father was the head priest, so the chief priest. So you can see that they had a lot in common. They were a team, basically. One of the most fascinating stories about King Josiah, though, is that he makes a huge political blunder. So he's seen as faithful. He's doing a good job. He's after God's heart. He's reviving, like almost a David-like figure, at least for Judah, and maybe not for all of Israel, of course. But then but he's always stuck, and Judah is always stuck in the middle between greater powers. And at this time, the Assyrians were way down. The Assyrians, who were, of course, based in Nineveh, had really became much weaker, and the Babylonians, and of course, we're familiar with King Nebuchadnezzar, very central figure in the Old Testament. He's part of that new Babylon, the Neo-Babylonians. They basically conquered the Assyrians, and there was a power vacuum, especially in the northern part of Israel and in that area, in those northern regions. So what happens? Well, the Pharaoh Neco, comes out of Egypt. He completely bypasses Judah. Judah's up in the hills. Jerusalem's way up in the mountains, and you don't have to deal with Judah if you're coming from Egypt. You just come up through the plains of Sharon, and you can get to northern Israel without even bothering with them. And that's exactly what Pharaoh Necho did. And there was a power vacuum. The Assyrians had crumbled, and he took advantage of that situation. He may have done it also as a defensive move. That is, Necho did it as a defensive move against the Babylonians coming down to Egypt too. We're not quite sure, but in any case, he goes up there, and in the Jezreel Valley near Megiddo, uh, uh, Judah or Josiah decides that he's going to side with the Neo Babylonians, basically, be their vassal king to them. And he starts making battle with the Egyptians in the Jezreel Valley, Megiddo area. And there's this really interesting thing in Second Chronicles 35 where it talks about, he goes, well, wait a minute. Necho says, wait a minute. I, I have nothing to do with you, King Josiah. Why are you even bothering? And he sends emissaries to say, look, just leave me alone and I won't bother with you. But Josiah goes in undercover, basically. He disguises himself and he makes battle with them anyway. And it's kind of a mystery why. Clearly, there was a political calculation, maybe being on the side of the Babylonians. Maybe they really didn't like the fact that the Egyptians were surrounding Judah now, because if they conquered the north and they'd be in the south, maybe Judah thought they would be next. Who knows? But the thing is that Josiah makes that political calculation and he gets killed. And there's two different versions. There's one in Second Kings and there's one in Second Chronicles. The one in Second Chronicles, Josiah gets wounded on the battlefield by an arrow, and he's taken by chariot back to Jerusalem, and then he subsequently dies in Jerusalem. In Second King, he dies on the battlefield. But regardless, after being together for all this time and all the reforms that Josiah had made, Josiah, it was said, pulled down the Asherah poles, got rid of the altars to the Baals and all of that, did a lot of, quote, good work for Yahweh. And then all of a sudden, he's gone. And Jeremiah's life crumbles around him, essentially. And then Jeremiah sees Josiah's children, two of his sons, basically, and there was they're kind of interregnum period, these short kingships, but the two main kingships, Jehoiakim and Zedekiah, uh, uh, just get steadily worse and worse and worse, and Jeremiah sees their faithlessness. And that's what the book of the Jeremiah is all about, is this long slide from a good king into faithlessness. I like to tell people, in fact, when I do my series on Jeremiah, I'm going to kind of say, you can't, um, of course, make modern parallels. You can overdo that, but you can do it a little bit just to illuminate things, as long as you don't go too far. I like to think of this period is Jeremiah is almost like being an eyewitness to the period in American history between the 1820s and the 1860s. In the 1820s, you had the time of the era of good feelings under President Monroe. You had the Second Great Awakening in religious history happening. And this was a period of great optimism. There was, technological changes. People thought that they could make the world a better place by doing things. This was when the abolition movement against slavery started. This is when you had greater women's rights. You had the beginning of labor rights. You had the beginning of public education starting to happen, things like that. And all of these movements are happening in this time of optimism. But what happens afterwards is steadily, there's, ups and downs, good presidents, bad presidents, but slowly, and it's almost inevitable, it looks inevitable to us in hindsight, is this long slide towards civil war. And like I said, you don't want to overdo it, but you could use that kind of analogy for Jeremiah too. It's just that an era of good feelings, things are going great, people are doing what they're supposed to be doing, and then this long, oh, almost 40-year slide into the exile. And so Jeremiah is explaining this. He's observing it. He's in the halls of power. He sees what's going on. And I like to say, if you're familiar with the concept of the Overton window, this is the idea of what a political consensus is at any given time. So you could say, what was the political consensus in the 1960s in America? Was, probably liberalism, or a kind of liberalism. And then what's the political consensus shifted in the Reagan era, for example? And it's certainly shifted in our era as well. Well, the same thing kind of happens here, is that you kind of get disoriented. You go, what's true? What's not true? What's acceptable, what's not acceptable. Different interpretations of things happen. And that's what's happening in Jeremiah, is that he thought, he had a North Star, and then all of a sudden the Overton window on him is shifting, and what becomes acceptable isn't anymore, or or wasn't, and things have changed. So here he is, a singular voice, just trying to stay steady, staying true to God, while the Overton window is shifting and the whole political environment is shifting around him. And that's what we're seeing here. And you have a couple of different ways you can respond to this. And we see that. We see that in the way some of the false prophets in the book of Jeremiah, Hananiah is a great example of that. And there are others in that you see how things are shifting all the time. I like to say you always have realpolitik versus diplomacy or faithfulness or optimism. I'll use the example of, um, you can respond to these changes and threats, say, in a realpolitik way. So that would be like Henry Kissinger, right? Kind of a cynical way. You're playing one off of the other. You're making moves behind the scenes. You're maybe being a little duplicitous. Sometimes that does work, but people get hurt too. And a lot of people today look at Kissinger as a very flawed character for sure, and maybe even kind of an evil figure because of that real politic and not having a moral core. You could take contrast it to say somebody like George C. Marshall, who in World War II and afterwards, his diplomacy was very clear, very morally based, and but he was considered a great leader for what he did. A little more controversial, a little bit later, would be like George H.W. Bush during the fall of the Soviet Union and, the fall of the Berlin Wall and then the Soviet Union, and navigating through that whole process of the reunification of Germany. If you know anything about the history of that period and deeply, you realize how fraught that was. That was a very, very dangerous period, and people could have gone really off rails. And it was basically between Helmut Kohl, the German chancellor, and George H.W. Bush. They were the ones that made that happen. They were very deft, very well done. So you can kind of see the two different kinds of ways you respond to things, right? And you can see that in scripture as well. You can see that there are people who kind of play games and twist things and do a lot of realpolitik. And those are people like the kings after King Josiah. And you can see people who generally are pretty faithful and have a clear agenda, a moral agenda. And we are told that Josiah himself was that way until he made his big political blunder by getting killed. So that's what the usefulness of these are. And that's why I think that Jeremiah is particularly important. Now, doesn't have the sweep of Isaiah. It doesn't have. It's a bit of a messier book in terms of the way it's constructed and the way it's kind of jumbled together. It looks like it was rewritten several times, at least what 6 or 7 times. If you look at it, and it so it makes it hard to read and so forth. But we have nothing else in the Old Testament like this, where we have this pretty extended period over several kings at such a pivotal moment in Scripture. And, maybe you could say this is kind of like Paul, seeing this big sweep of history and being involved in over so many decades. You could kind of say maybe, again, parallels aren't great there because the these are 500 years apart, right? So they're vastly different cultures and different times and everything. But I think that's very useful from a historical perspective. I will mention that lot of my ideas, a lot of things that I understand about these Old Testament prophets come from Walter Brueggemann, who I think has a very clear, not necessarily historical perspective. He kind of pushed against that a little bit. His point of view was more in terms of the narrative, right? And the text, and the idea that, especially the narrative, in saying what was it that these people needed to know, what stories did they need to tell, for their time to consolidate their religion and to consolidate themselves together. And that's what we're seeing here. And in fact, that's what you see what the Deuteronomists were doing, is that they were retelling the story in the book of Deuteronomy, and also their influences over others, other books in Scripture. They were retelling the story to make it relevant for that time in the history and the consolidation of the Yahweh cult, or the beginnings of what we call Judaism. Now, it would change again about 2 centuries later with the chroniclers, and the chroniclers would look at this and retell the story, not under the threat of exile of the Babylonian Empire, but they had the protection of the Persians to begin with, and they had a period where their main concern was, how do we stay together with and not break apart like they did before? And that consolidation is really what you see from the chronicler as well. So that's what these large, long sweeps of history are. So that's why I say that Josiah is the most important king that you don't know, or you may know the name, but not realize how central it was for monotheism, for centralization of Yahweh, the God of Israel, in the temple in Jerusalem, to bring the Passover story. There's this beautiful thing about how the Passover was celebrated again under King Josiah, and how Jeremiah, the weeping prophet, the one who lamented so much, that bore his soul. We see so much of what kind of person he was and how he bore his soul was in this time too. So we get this really amazing picture that is really at the center of the Old Testament. And you really can't see the earlier parts of the earlier books without seeing it with this Deuteronomist lens on. We don't know how much or which exactly, but it's certainly there. And you could say the same thing is that, of course, the chronicler and the second temple period, they looked back to these texts, and there are large parts of First and Second Chronicles that are lifted almost word for word from the earlier texts. So you can see that they were definitely using them. So that's why it's so central. So with that, I'd like to say this is one thing, and if you get it, it really is in the Bible, and it's really central to the Bible. Where people ignore this period, or people don't understand this sweep of history and how things have changed, that's not really in the Bible. Or it's not really being true to the narrative of the Old Testament, like I said, which Walter Brueggemann does a great job of talking about, and the narrative that people needed in order to do what they needed to do in that time. So, with that, I would say, God bless you. I hope that you can hear this or look at these books and become as excited about them as I am. With that, God bless you.